Welcome to this episode of the Customer-Centric Retailing Podcast, a forum for retail leaders to discuss industry trends, challenges, and opportunities.
This is Anil.
And this is Fabi, and each episode we invite some of the brightest minds in the industry to discuss the future of customer centricity, with topics ranging from the rise of e-commerce to brick-and-mortar operations, to omni-channel technology to retail culture, and how all of these elements come together to create customer-centric retailing. Today we have with us Steve Dennis. Steve has over 30 years of experience as a strategic advisor, board member, and C-level executive at 2 Fortune 500 retailers. He is also a senior contributor to Forbes magazine, and his insights are regularly featured in the media, including Bloomberg, CNN, Fortune, and many others. Welcome to the podcast, Steve. We've been waiting to have you on, and we're so excited to talk to you today.
Well, thank you. I'm excited to be with you guys.
Great. Well, there's so much for us to talk to you about today, but just to start us off, you've had such an interesting career and you've worked with some of the best retailers in the world. So I'm just curious, what attracted you to the industry to begin with and ultimately led to creating such a long-lasting career in this space?
Well, I'd like to tell you as part of some master plan or some passion that I had early in my life. The reality is it was a bit accidental. After I got out of business school, I worked for a big consulting firm for a couple of years, and I worked with a mix of retail and consumer goods companies. And then I spent a couple of years or a few years in the food business, but I was really eager. Well, I knew I wanted to work with companies that had a direct relationship with the customer. That much I knew. But what I was really motivated by was trying to get into more of a general management role, which wasn't possible where I was at the time. And I just happened to hear about this opportunity to go into a strategy and business development role at Sears. This is like 30 years ago now. This makes you feel quite old. And there was actually a track record of, I thought I was going to leverage my skills, but there was actually a track record of going into this group and working for a year or two more in kind of an internal consulting capacity and then moving into a general management role. So that's what really attracted me to it. And it turned out that that was the way it played out. And then I ended up being at Sears for 12 years, working my way up to the C-suite there and then on to Neiman Marcus. And, so I just kept kind of moving along as new opportunities presented themselves. And I guess at a certain point, I had to accept that I was a retailer. And I didn't know how to do anything else. So here I am.
We always like asking that question just because retail is such a far-reaching and inclusive industry, and there's so many people from so many different backgrounds. So it's always interesting to see how people have found their way in there. But we're big fans of your book, Remarkable Retail, which you actually updated as a result of the pandemic. And one of the things that you wrote is retail's problems didn't start with the pandemic. In fact, a radical reset has been brewing since the turn of the century. So what are some of those seeds of disruption that you think have been brought to the forefront as a result of this pandemic? And how do you think retailers can best prepare for the radical reset that you write about?
Well, just stepping back for a second, there are a few things that started to happen in, I would say, the late 90s. So when I was at Sears, my second to last role was, and Sears was very forward thinking actually in this regard. They obviously have missed a lot of other things along the way, but we were pretty early investors in growing our .com business. And I actually led an enterprise initiative, which was called multi-channel integration or omni-channel, as we would call it. And there were two things I think that were most important that I started to see, and I think that have kind of played out over the last 20 years or so. One is just obviously the rise of e-commerce. And, the reason why I call it remarkable retail is really this idea that you can't get away with being even very good anymore. And the main reason for that is that you think about a world where basically you had 98% of all sales being done in a physical store. The consumer had to go there. You could only buy what happened to be carried by that particular retailer. You had to go during store hours. Most of the information you got was from traditional advertising, maybe a salesperson, maybe your neighbor. And then you had basically mail order catalog. Well, as the internet developed, and not only could you get access to product whenever you wanted to, but you could have virtually, the so-called endless aisle. You could get information. That changed fundamentally the basis of competition. So the scarcity that allowed a lot of retailers to have competitive advantage continued to be evaporated. That really has led to what I call the collapse of the middle. Retailers that have been successful basically either focused on value, convenience, dominant assortment, those sorts of things, Walmart, Amazon, Costco, et cetera, or they focused more on service, unique product, and so forth. And everybody else in the middle basically has found themselves into increasing trouble over the years. That's been exacerbated, particularly in the United States, a little bit in Canada and a couple other markets, by the rampant overbuilding of physical capacity. So those two forces, just built through the 2000s, and really started to come home to roost, so to speak, prior to the pandemic, where we started to see an awful lot of store closings, bankruptcies, and just poor investment performance on the part of those retailers that didn't kind of pick a lane. The pandemic, I think, obviously, I mean, everybody's made this point that it's accelerated a lot of trends. And certainly, if you were a non essential retailer or you were overly reliant on physical retail, it was especially bad. Um, but I think the pandemic mostly taught us that the lines between physical and digital have blurred or continue to blur. And it's created what I call more sort of this hybrid model that physical stores need to evolve to. That's no longer good enough just to be a place for consumers to go see stuff, pick it up, take it home with them. It's become much more diverse.
So, Steve, this is really interesting. We see that you started in like late '90s, and we are in like here in '20s, and still those the middle layer you're talking about, all these brands that are like in the mid, especially in the fashion, right, mid and a little bit higher upper middle. Like Tommy or Zara or Ralph Lauren, and these brands, they actually are in a unique situation because their margins are not as great compared to like a high-end luxury brands like Burberry or Prada or any of these, right? But then the customer expectation for all the expectation is very high, particularly because they are serving these brands are serving middle class, right? Yeah, I can let me talk about my experience. Like over the weekend, I was in Soho here in New York and went to one of the very best outdoor brand. Went to their store, and the experience was like certain level of disappointment, just because I come from the tech background. I would not say that I don't want to use the word disappointment, but like what happens is still even today, it's like these brands having difficulty to put in the right kind of experience in the store in terms of availability of product, the enablement of the associates. Like associates are still working with this good old point of sale system that has like all information. Beyond that, they don't know much. Where the inventory is, they don't know. So I think these stores have a challenge of like what is their role actually? What role do these stores play, particularly for like a mid and upper middle specialty brand retailers or fashion brand retailers? So the real challenge here is like how are these brands that are like a mid and upper middle tier in the fashion, particularly fashion specialty brand retailers, what do you think? How would they transform themselves and deliver the experience to the customer, especially like today when customers are expecting seamless, connected experience?
Well, to a certain degree, I think it depends. There's kind of the strategy layer or the brand strategy layer, which is fundamentally what makes you remarkable as a brand that is going to cause consumers to prefer you over all the other choices they have, right? Then there's the more tactical level, which is what do you need to do on a day-to-day basis to stay competitive? And I think brands have, all manner of problems, right? They don't necessarily have a brand positioning that's powerful enough. The reason why I say the bar has been raised is, using your example, if you go back 20 years, if you were a well-known brand, chances are there was only one or two places you could buy that brand, whether you had your own store, you were selling through Macy's or whatever it might be, and consumers didn't have the ability to access the product, substitute products or that product in particular from anywhere in the world. So you have to create even more uniqueness, more memorability around your brand just to get the customer's attention and willingness to check you out now. Secondarily, to your point, as customers' expectations have gone up, I remember, for example, Mindy Grossman, when she was at HSN, she was at maybe the NRF conference, and she said, consumers value you today on their last best experience. If I had a great experience at a hotel or I had a great experience on Amazon, I kind of expect that sort of great experience to carry through in everything I do. And again, that wasn't so easy customers didn't have that comparison so much. So I think you have to go through both at a strategy level, your brand positioning, why are customers going to be attracted and stay loyal to your brand? That may mean better product, that may mean more unique advertising, that may mean a change in your distribution strategy, and then you've got to do all the things at store level to make it worth the customer trafficking your store in the first place, and figure out those things that are important to conversion and billing average ticket and all the kind of essential pieces of retail.
Yeah, in fact, the store experience is definitely needs a real facelift or like a big changes there, because today when we know statistically that the customer will not wait if your website takes more than 5 seconds to load. Similarly, when they walk in the store, they expect certain level of responsiveness from your team there, or from the engagement from the stores, which also means that we have to rethink how we operate our stores, what stores have to offer, and why customers should even come to the stores. So again, same thing. For the high end, it's a very different story. For Walmart, it's a different story, purely necessity based sales and all that. It's these people in the middle, and they need to actually rethink their stores in store. While we know that people really want to go in the store, but they will not just go in the store because they want to. It's like you have to really deliver some value to them in the store, and the experience has to be memorable, like you say. To be able to engage the customer and bring them back again.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things I talk about in the book, and it's certainly a little bit of an overly black and white example, but I make this distinction, which others have made as well, between buying and shopping. Buying being more kind of a left brain, logical, I'm on a mission, just get it off my list, to-do list kind of example, and shopping, being more discovery, more emotional, usually more complicated in terms of what it takes for the customer to decide ultimately what to buy. And again, overly simplified, but the internet is really good on the buying side and generally pretty terrible on the shopping side. And I think one thing that many retailers get wrong is they try to keep kind of, I call it a slightly better version of mediocre. And I don't mean to pick on any particular company, but I will pick on Macy's. Macy's keeps trying to make what they do and have done for 20, 30, 40 years a little bit better. But the reality is they've lost a lot of their business to the buying side of the house, to off-price retailers, to online. And there's very little they're going to do to win those customers back into a physical store. At the same time, there's a lot of business that has been traded up, so to speak, to Nordstrom and specialty retailers, whether that's online or in a store. And that requires that the store experience and the web experience be significantly better than it is functionally, but also in a highly differentiated way. Because if I can get the same product anywhere and I don't have to have the hassle of going to a store, or if I'm the sort of person that wants to be associated, and this gets back to the brand strategy, I want to be the sort of person that gets their clothing from a brand I can brag about, whether that is a Nordstrom or it's a product brand. There's very little you're going to do to win that business back if you don't fundamentally and very significantly change your brand image. So these are all really vexing problems. And I think as it relates to physical retail in particular, for those in the middle, one of the real struggles is, and I certainly experienced this at Sears and to a lesser degree at Neiman Marcus, is there's a lot of investment in a lot of physical space, that is not built for modern retail. And it's a very difficult thing to say, well, do I put another, 2, 3, 4 billion dollars into an outdated physical business model, or do I do something really different with that? And once you get into that situation, which I think, J.C. Penney, many others have found themselves in, it's not at all clear what the right answer is, because they waited 15, 20 years to make the changes they needed to make. And so I don't mean to be so pessimistic about it, but when you sit down and say, for Macy's as an example, or J.C. Penney, to be viable businesses, they have to increase their market share on a trade area by trade area basis by probably 20, 30, 40% compared to 2019. How is that going to happen? Like, what is going to happen that's going to allow them to win back that much business at a expense level and capital investment that makes any kind of sense? And so I think many of these businesses, unfortunately, it's kind of a slow slide to oblivion, because they watched the last 20 years happen to them, and now they're so far behind that it's unlikely they'll catch up.
To your point about physical space, that's actually an area I wanted to dive into a little bit more detail with you, is about modern store design. What are some of the ways that you've seen retailers kind of reimagine their store layouts, particularly over the course of the pandemic, but also in general, to accommodate more modern buying behavior and expectations?
Well, there are a couple things. One is to get away from just being quite average, and usually the way that's done is, or the best way to do it, number one, which sounds obvious, but I'm still amazed more companies don't do it, is that have a very clear idea of who your customer is and why they shop with you, and what are the table stakes and what does it take to be memorable. And so really getting that clarity, not trying to be a little bit of everything to everybody, which is the problem with the mediocre middle in general, is really important. The second, and I'll give you a couple examples and specific examples in a second, but I think the second thing, and I just wrote a piece for Forbes on this, is what I call the hybridization of retail, which there are many manifestations of this, but particular to stores. Almost every store on the planet. In fact, I had Brendan Witcher on my podcast, Brendan Witcher from Forrester, some of your listeners may know. And I said, basically stores were built during the 80s, 90s, and really until recently, with a very singular purpose, which was they were places for customers to go, see stuff, pick it out, and take it home with them. And so when I was at Sears, when I was at Neiman Marcus, there was this big push in store design. It's not even really design. It's space allocation to maximize the selling square footage and minimize the back office space. And that was this model of customers coming to see stuff and pick it out and take it home, right? Now, we've got many retailers that are fulfilling the vast majority of their e-commerce orders from their stores, whether that's customers coming to get it, buy online, pick up at store, curbside pickup, it's home delivery runners coming to take the product off the shelves to deliver it to the home, or it's literally e-commerce fulfillment. So you've got stores that went from the traditional role to now being fulfillment centers. You generally have a much more service-oriented component to the store, whether it's buy online, pick up in store, buy online, return to store. You often, more and more retailers are realizing that stores are great advertising for their e-commerce business. So you have to think not only about sort of the warehousing part of the store, but the brand building, advertising part of the store, and so on. So that will play out differently for different sort of retailers, certainly, more showroom component versus more service component or whatever. But that can imply some pretty significant changes in the layout of the store, the design of the store, the operating model of the store. And in many cases, it suggests you need totally different stores, smaller, bigger, different locations. So, the couple retailers that I usually talk to in this regard, one, on the first example, one is Restoration Hardware, which 7 or 8 years ago started to realize that their format wasn't really working in terms of being truly remarkable, and I'm sure many people know, have developed these RH Gallery stores, which was a very counterintuitive idea of putting more money into physical locations and making them bigger, when most retailers were moving in the opposite direction. And it's turned out to work really, really well. And one of the reasons why it works really, really well is if you are the sort of customer that RH desires to win, grow, and keep, you basically have to go to that store. It is such a strong experience that you have to go there. Now you still have to convert the traffic, but the way they have just sort of sucked in the traffic in that part of the market, I mean, it's, they have 5-6 times the traffic that they had. They just, in Dallas where I am, they just opened a new store, and compared to their old store, I mean, it's just much, much more traffic because they have made it a very memorable place to go. On the other, in a very different mold, if you look at what Best Buy, Tractor Supply, Target, Walmart have done, is they've invested in their stores both to make the kind of traditional store experience better, but mostly to reflect this blurred world of digital and online. That they don't think about it as stores versus e-commerce. They think about, in this trade area, how do we maximize our potential regardless of how the customer shops, and what does that mean for our stores? And so I think many retailers like those still have a way to go to get there. But when you start looking at the customer journey without regard to channel, or getting caught up in sort of the e-commerce versus brick and mortar, but see it as one thing, it yields a lot of different opportunities. But it's expensive and complicated to do, for sure. But I think those that had a good foundation to begin with, did very well in the pandemic, because the pandemic accelerated this blurred behavior. And so much of the growth in e-commerce, this is one of the false narratives, I think, in COVID, was that, e-commerce got accelerated as e-commerce as a separate thing. But a lot of that incremental growth actually required a store, a physical presence, to be able to satisfy that demand. Target's e-commerce business is like 90% fulfilled by stores. So I think a lot of people misunderstand that. So that's a lot of big changes in terms of how stores have to operate and how they have to be designed.
So Steve, what you said is like a really, really big change. In fact, it's like a ground up everything you had to rethink, because the customer's journeys have changed. Why the customer coming to the store has changed. Like you said, the customer has the stores have a totally new kind of roles to play, like, shipping of the item to customer service, and buy online, pickup in store, and lots of other things. So what do you think, this is like a big undertaking, and we know that pandemic brought in, and a lot of stores started shipping. So now the store associates and the store operation models have included ship from store type of strategy, and buy online, pickup in store, or curbside pickup. So they have a flavor of it. But as we come out of this pandemic situation, what do you think, how are store associates or store people going to respond to change? Will they go back to the good old way of operations, or how are management going to, because I see, for example, when you go in the store even today, and you say, if they don't have certain thing in stock, the associate really wants you to place the order and get the item shipped to your home. And if you ask them, this happened really, if you ask them, hey, isn't the same as me placing order online and getting it delivered to my home? They confuse you. Say, well, you may not get free shipping, when actually you will. So what I'm trying to get to is the store associates are still insecure, and the store operations team is still insecure, and they think they keep themselves away from the online channel. So to me, it seems like a big undertaking, because we are talking about human and how they think and how they operate. So what are retailers doing? What kind of strategies do you suggest retailers to address to this? Because tech is easy, buying real estate, okay, we have a finite thing, and we know if we have money, we can get real estate, we can get technology. But this is human, our people that we've had for years. Now we want them to operate differently.
Yeah. Well, first of all, with respect to what you said at the outset, I mean, I don't think there's any going back in terms of the trends we've seen accelerated. I think many of them are going to moderate. I think we're already, people talk about the great acceleration. I talk about the great moderation, which, we saw this great distortion in grocery, at the expense of restaurants, that's moderating, people buying Pelotons and office equipment. There's only so many new desks and computers and sofas and so forth you can buy. So I think we'll see some moderation in the distortion in spending, and we'll see we're already seeing moderation in the growth of e-commerce. But we're at a higher level than we were. So much has been accelerated. Generally more like 2 or 3 years, not the 10 years that people talk about. But we're at a different level. So I think, you have to accept the reality and deal with it. But to your point, I mean, I'm still, there's some fundamental pieces of bringing together what I call a harmonized shopping experience. And you absolutely have to have the tech in place and the store design in place and the supply chain in place, et cetera, to do this well. It is the cultural pieces that are the hardest. And number one, I think you have to have the top, not I think, I know, you have to have the top leadership team being very clear on, channel agnosticity, new measurements, putting the customer at the center, rooting out the battles between .com and physical stores. So, I mean, if you don't have that top down, relentless, we're going to make this happen, that's not likely to cascade down to the frontline associates. I think the other things you have to do. I mean, you do have to change the metrics. I think we have to stop talking about e-commerce growth and comp store sales growth. You have to have two kinds of metrics fundamentally to do harmonized retail well. You have to have customer segment goals, and you have to lay out how many customers in each of those segments you have to acquire, how much growth you're looking for, how much retention you're looking for, how much advocacy you're looking for, regardless of what channel they shop in. Not that you shouldn't pay some attention to that and use that to inform your strategies. But, for example, just to pick the Macy's example, what Macy's should talk about is to say, we have these, I'm making this up, 5 customer segments that are going to drive our growth in the future. Here's how we expect them to contribute to our growth proportionately. Here are the strategies we have for each of those segments. And here's how we're doing. We also have a strategy to grow every market trade area we're in by 20% next year, regardless of the channel. Here's what we're doing to make that happen, and here's why you shouldn't get too obsessed about sales per square foot productivity, because we know a lot of investments in store have their ROI online, and a lot of investments in ROI have their payoff in store. So you have to have those metrics to inform your strategy, and then you have to cascade down those pieces, and that will tell you what sort of technology you have to have in place in store to help sales associates serve the customer. That will tell you whether you even have the right sort of sales associates. I mean, the reality in some of these situations, which I've seen with other retailers, is look, we're going to see the customer as the channel, and you have to get on board, and we'll give you a little bit of time and support to get there. But if you're going to keep fighting the change we need to put in place, then we're going to have to ask you to work elsewhere, and that goes through management as well. So it's certainly not easy. Changing a culture that's deeply ingrained, very few companies do that successfully, and I'm not aware of any that do it quickly. So again, it's a little bit of why I'm pessimistic on some of these retailers that have been struggling for 20 years really changing, because it's the cultural change as much as it's the merchandise assortment or the advertising strategy or supply chain, whether they have micro fulfillment or robots or things like that.
Yeah, in fact, to your point, like definitely it has to be a top-down approach, and has to be like a real commitment needed. At the same time, I think the commitment level for enabling the store people, like people at the lower level, at the operations level in the store, is super important. For example, it's very you will see this very often, that a customer of certain brand can look up the store inventory and make a decision if they want to buy online and pick up in store, or do a curbside pickup or whatever. But when you go in the store associates don't have the tools to answer customers' questions, right? Now, this is where I see that leadership team really need to think, is like they are giving all these sophisticated, powerful things, tools to the customers so they can make their buying decisions. But the same is not reflecting in the back end. Like, companies need to really come in and discuss or re-engineer their internal processes, but then also enable their people with the right kind of tools, so the people are excited about it, they are productive, and once they are productive and they are able to be, if they are successful, I'm sure that cultural change will come in easy, and people will really adopt to the new, harmonized retail, as you say, as a strategy.
Yeah, I mean, I know I agree with you. I think I mean, you always have to give tools to your people to make them as successful as they can be. And I mean, it's been my experience. I mean, even going back way back to Sears in our early days in e-commerce, in our appliance area, we had um, commissioned salespeople, and at the time, we were the by far the biggest seller of major appliances in the world. And as we started to develop the .com business, one of the things that happened, which was good in some cases for sales associates, was that customers were doing their research online, and then they were coming in and they kind of narrowed down their choices, either the type of, I want gas versus electric, or I'm trying to decide between Gen Air and Maytag or whatever it might be. So they came in much more narrowed down. So that saved the sales associate a lot of time in terms of like walking around the whole department and taking a half an hour to explain things, got much more focused. But what's happened over time, whether we're talking about appliances or fashion and some other areas that I've worked in, is the consumer's almost always going to know more, really, than the salesperson about product specifications and reviews and things like that. And it's generally impossible, even for even the best sales associates, to have all that stuff in their head, right? So this advantage they had 20 years ago of information relative to consumer, that's totally flipped. So you're not going to change that phenomenon. But to your point, you can give sales associates, not only training, but technology, whether it's a tablet, the companies that have earpieces that allow you to talk to experts very very quickly without having to go get on a phone or go to the back office and find somebody. So there's lots of things that can deal with the reality of the digitally enabled shopping experience. And yeah, if companies aren't doing that, you're really not getting you're not dealing with the reality of shopping today, but you're also not positioning your sales team and store teams for success.
In your book, you write a lot about the importance of retailers being customer centric, which, by the name of the podcast, is something that we clearly believe in as well. But you say that very few retailers have actually achieved it. And you say that these efforts are often underfunded because the return on investment can sometimes be difficult to measure, at least at the outset. So I'm curious what your message is to retailers who continue to be resistant to change. How can they kind of get out of that mindset and make a change, even if the business case isn't going to be rock solid the minute that they make the decision?
Well, there's an aspect of um, faith, I guess. I don't mean that in the religious sense, but when I got to Neiman Marcus, just a quick story. When I got to Neiman Marcus, we were and I had a number of the things that me and my team were trying to drive. Most of them around busting the silos and seeing the customers, the channel. I mean, those were ideas that I carried with me from Sears, and we had a very siloed culture at Neiman's. It was very difficult for a bunch of reasons, which is a longer story to make those changes. But Nordstrom um, was making a lot of the changes. And I didn't, I kind of knew they didn't have a business case. I've subsequently learned that they didn't really have a business case. But the belief on the part of the team, the leadership there, it's a family led company for the most part. They had at the center of the way they thought about their business, putting the customer first. Now that was very much when the customer comes into the shoe department or whatever, like it was a sales process in store. But as e-commerce started to become obviously a bigger part of what was going on, and people were going to the web before coming into the store. I mean, we saw that 15 years ago. It's not a new phenomenon. Uh, Nordstrom somehow got to the point where they said, part of that customer first mantra means we have to facilitate um, the customer sales process in the best way. So if you come into a store and we don't have it in stock, we have to figure out a way to get it to you. And the way to get it to you is to ship it to your home or office from our e-commerce stock. So we have to change point of sale to make that happen. So they made a leap of faith that the world was going to end up in it very different, and that even though we couldn't carve out a business case that says, here's the ROI in the next 3 years, we just believe that's fundamentally the right thing to do. And I think all visionary leaders, it's kind of like we're going to the moon, right? Like that's where we're going, and we're going to move in that direction. That doesn't mean you have to make some difficult decisions along the way, but I think that's the starting point. Leaders have to articulate a vision. They have to say we have these fundamental beliefs and values, and that's going to guide our decisions, and we believe in the long run it will work out. But more tactically, it gets back to what I was saying earlier. I think while it's difficult to do all this attribution, you don't have to not do it just because you can't do it perfectly. I think you make the best business case, and lots of retailers have figured out how to better measure the impact on the customer, even though the attribution is difficult. So I think you start at a high level and you keep working your way through it. But I mean, it's like anything, when you say you're customer centric, you have to force yourself to say, okay, well, what does that mean? What does being customer centric look like? Not as a poster in the break room, but what would have to be true in the future for us to say we've gone from being a 6 in terms of being customer centric to a 9 or 10. And I think it's just like omni-channel too. Oh, we're going to be omni-channel. And then you ask, well, okay, what does that even mean? And you get 20 different definitions. So I think it's putting meat on the bones, so to speak, around what some of these things mean. I always ask sorry, it's a very rambling answer, but I almost always ask clients. I just had a call yesterday with a big retailer I'm starting to work with, and they were articulating their vision for some things. And I said, well, okay, well, tell me what good looks like. Just describe it. Describe before, describe after. Like when this is successful, what will you be able to say and measure? And it's surprising to me sometimes that that's not done. It's done in a very general way, or because you can't do it perfectly, you don't do it at all. And I think that's a real missed opportunity.
I love the moon landing analogy, and we can certainly commiserate that a lot of people are using buzzwords. Everyone says they're omni-channel, and then when you ask them, what does that really mean? They say, oh, well, we have a website and we have a store, and that's really not what the word is meant to mean. So I think, that's a good piece of advice for retailers to actually sit down and think about what they want the word to mean and what good looks like in your words. There are a million more questions that we can ask you, but I think we can leave it there. We covered a lot of ground in today's episode. Thank you so much for joining us today, and we highly recommend to our audience picking up a copy of Remarkable Retail and tuning in to the Remarkable Retail podcast. Before we let you go, though, are there any other updates, maybe sneak peeks that you want to share with our audience, and what is the best way for them to keep up with you?
Well, the best way for them to keep up with me is probably on Twitter and LinkedIn, where I'm pretty active, at Stephen P. Dennis. My website is Stephen P. Dennis, Stephen with a V, pdennis.com. What's next for me? I mean, I'm continuing to do a lot of what I've been doing. Probably the biggest shift for sure is I'm starting to produce more individual content on my blog and at Forbes, where I'm a senior contributor. And I'm looking forward. I've done a lot of virtual talks, but I'm looking forward to getting out there in real life and getting in front of an audience again, which is very slowly starting to come back. And I enjoy communicating these ideas in person, but I mostly enjoy getting to see people in real life and talk with them and frankly get feedback on a lot of my content. My content gets a lot better when people engage with it and tell me when I'm wrong or gloss over things or give me different examples. So can do that on Twitter, can do that on LinkedIn, but I'm looking forward to doing that in person later in the year and into next year.
We're all looking forward to some real life interaction, I'm sure. It's been such a pleasure having you on. We hope to have you on again in the future because there's, again, about a million other topics we could cover with you. But in the meantime, thank you so much for joining us, and thank you to our audience for tuning in.
Thanks, Steve.
That's it for this episode of the Customer-Centric Retailing Podcast featuring our special guest, Steve Dennis. Steve is a pragmatist when it comes to retail because he knows the type of commitment, investment, and culture necessary to succeed. Mediocre simply won't cut it when your customers expect seamless and frictionless. And the pandemic has only made the gap between excellent and poor retail that much more obvious. If you like what you heard, you can subscribe on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and Google Podcasts. Please rate and review and recommend to a friend or fellow retail fanatic. This podcast is brought to you by Hot Wax Commerce.